Well, this is another story on the darker side of boxing. This one is about fearless Freddie Mills, a British champion, a Commonwealth champion, fought for the European title throughout his career, even got in the ring with the great Joey Maxim. But this is a different tale. This is a tale of the dark side of his life. This is a tale about some of the craziest stories you've ever seen. And if you think some of the episodes that we've covered already, guys like Arturo Gatti, Carlos Monzon, Edwin Valero, and even Sonny Liston, if you think they were dark, wait until you hear this one, Johnston. This is the epitome of what we're doing. This is the darker side of boxing. This is the secret life of Freddie Mills.
This is one of the most compelling stories that I believe we've ever investigated and looked into. I mean, we've not done many, but we've looked into these sort of crime stuff. We're both interested in it, whether it's boxing or not. And this is quite simply one of the craziest stories I've ever heard in my life. And I can't wait to tell it, to be quite honest with you. This is just brilliant. I mean, it's not it's not for Freddie. I don't mean to laugh there. There are so many odd pieces to the puzzle that we're going to try to give you as listeners, and you can make your mind up at the end of it what you think happened with Freddie Mills in his life. But just mind-blowing, absolutely mind-blowing this is.
So as always, we're going to go back to the beginning. We're going to start going through the life of Freddie Mills, everything that leads into the main part of the story, and of course, as Johnston was saying, giving people the chance to make their own decision based on the information presented to them in this episode about what they think happened to Freddie Mills. So, Freddie Mills was born Frederick Percival Mills on the 26th of June 1919 in Bournemouth, Hampshire, and was the youngest of his family. He had a sister, Cece, and two brothers, Charlie and Jim, and they were the children of Lottie Hilda Gray and Thomas James Mills. Now, Thomas was a toter by trade, which is someone who collects unwanted household items and sells them to resellers. He was like a rag and bone man, basically, for anybody who wants to put it in that perspective. He was also a marine store dealer. Now, by the time Freddie was aged 8, his brother Charlie, who he worshipped, was a semi-professional boxer. And this was the moment that Freddie decided that he wanted to be like his older brother. Now, Cece recalls that it was Charlie that encouraged Freddie to take up boxing, and she said, "In the end, my dad had a huge old shed at the back of the garden, and they made it into a gym. They used to go in there every night sparring, and that was it. That was the beginning."
Yeah, they were a very poor family, and they lived in a terraced house on the breadline, which meant that Freddie, who was a keen artist, was unable to follow his first love and attend art college because his parents basically, they couldn't afford it, they were broke. And Freddie turned all his attention to boxing once that art dream was over, and received his first pair of boxing gloves when he was 11 years old, and he would spar with his brother Charlie as often as he could. During this time, he attended St Michael's School in Bournemouth until the age of 14, and then became an apprentice gardener and later the milkman's assistant. Now, the milkman was Percy Cook, the brother of the former Welsh lightweight champion Gordon Cook. He also worked on a dairy with Sissy's future husband, who was Harold Jackson, until every Saturday, and he enjoyed the graft of pushing the cart around in all the residential streets.
Now, by now, Freddie was becoming tired of working on the milk floats, and he wished for a life in boxing. Cece reflected on the moment Freddie wanted to take boxing serious, and she said, "He came home one day, and my mother said to him, 'I don't think you're very happy.' Freddie said he wasn't, so she said, 'Well, what do you want to do?' So he said, 'I want to be a boxer, and I want to go on to the booths.' Freddie's mum was not best pleased with his decision, but in the end, she gave in and told him to try it and see how he got on. It wasn't long before Cece recalls Freddie coming home with 2 black eyes and a swollen ear, and having to get some leeches from the chemist so they could suck all the blood out of his swollen ear. Now, this was when Freddie met Ma McEwen, who ran a family boxing booth in Bournemouth. And she was not only the first to give him an opportunity, but also his first beating. Ma recollects that Freddie did not have the money to get into a booth, so he used to peep in and watch, and when Ma caught him, she hit him. And she said, "I hit him really hard. He said, I'll be back to watch again, and I said, no you won't. We've got a boy for you next week, and you're going to fight in the ring. I told my husband that he won't be back, but he came back, and he nearly killed the boy that we put him in the ring with."
She sounds like a right character, Ma, and during this time, Freddie would box 24 rounds a day alongside William Daniel, aka Gypsy Daniels, and Jimmy Jury, and he picked up a few shillings along the way. And Ma, he didn't actually like Freddie's style. She said that he was very orthodox, and in her own words, she said, "I didn't like the way he would shape up for his fights. He didn't look nice in the ring. He always looked awkward. So he wasn't very pleasing to watch. Not pleasing to me anyway." Now, Ma does know her stuff. There is a little documentary. There's a couple on YouTube, and she's on there, and she's a right character. And as you can tell, she weren't afraid to give these youngsters a clip round the hero. And it was at this time that the Westover ice rink was the place to go when fighters turned professional. And it was at that venue that Freddie basically seized an opportunity in the novice competition where they had to box 3 one-minute rounds, with the winner taking the Rose Bowl. Because his mum did not want him to box, he entered the competition under the name Freddie Mills of Parkson. So his mum wouldn't find out. Not the best of undercover names there, but and that's what he did.
Now, Freddie was encouraged by his performances, so at the age of 16, he decided to turn over to the professional ranks after learning his trade in the booths and in the novice tournaments, of course. Most of his fights, through the 30s, were at Westover Ice Rink, and from 1936 to 1939, he picked up several admirers for his attacking street fighter style, which accumulated a record of 40 wins, 25 knockouts, 60 defeats, and 5 draws in just the short space of 3 years. An amateur boxer and friend in these days, Peter McInnes, would watch in admiration of his warrior-like instincts, who would never retreat, even when walking through a sea of punches, McInnes said. "In all, I see him here at Westover Ice Rink in 49 bounce. He used to pack this place out every second Wednesday. He was a real crowd pleaser. He would never fail to force the fight from the first bell. He had this wonderful aggressive style. He chin tucked behind the left shoulder, and somehow, in not the correct boxing stance, he learned the left hook. It was a natural punch." Now, Freddie was now getting noticed beyond the South, and his war service in the Royal Air Force actually increased his prospects of becoming a real star. Now, the RAF actually supported Freddie, who would spend his limited leave time fighting in bouts, so it wasn't long, of course, before he ended up going on to being made a sergeant. He became a corporal physical training instructor as well, and by June the 20th, 1942, he was ready to challenge Private Len Harvey, who had an amazing record of 122 wins, 13 losses and 10 draws for the Commonwealth and British Empire light heavyweight titles in front of 25,000 fans at White Hart Lane. That's the home of Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, for anybody that didn't know that. Now, Freddie went into the fight as the underdog, with many predicting that Harvey would box his way to victory comfortably, even though he hadn't fought for 3 years, but he had never been stopped in his whole career. They were hugely mistaken. Freddie put Harvey down for the count of 9 in the second round before knocking him through the ropes and down to the floor, only to be counted out while still outside of the ring.
That footage is on YouTube, and I really, for those boxing fans, go and have a look at it. It's a devastating knockout. He literally punches him through the ropes. It's impressive, and then obviously during the war and after winning the British title, Freddie had become idolised for his heroism in the ring. Just the way that McGuinness described in there, it was that sort of style that people liked, and someone who was willing to go into the trenches and brawl his way to victory or defeat epitomised that great British spirit in such hard times. And his performances in the ring would lift the spirit of a nation, making him a national treasure, and he was. And even though he hadn't gone on to do even more things which we're going to go into. And yet, in his book, Freddie said that he started to suffer with severe bouts of depression. And no matter how much he tried, he just couldn't shake it off. Now, Professor Brian J. Ford, who's a scientist and forensic investigator, begged the question, was this a psychological problem or was he suffering from brain damage?
It's an interesting question, and one that will start to become, I think, more evident over the course of the episode. Now, following the victory over Harvey, Freddie joined up with one of the best and well-known managers in the country. It was Ted Broadrib, and he began an affair with Broadrib's daughter, Christine Marie McCorkindale, also known as Chrissy, who was currently married to and had a son with South African boxer and good friend of Freddie's, Don McCorkindale. And Chrissy spoke of the moment they actually met. I went to Leicester with my parents for an August bank holiday weekend in 1941. We met during one of his fights when my father and Freddie were negotiating. I thought he was rather nice and quite the comedian. He was a lovable and very affectionate person. He didn't walk anywhere, he flew. And it was quite clear that Freddie had certainly left that impression on Chrissy after their first meeting.
I'd say, quite a statement from Chrissy. And from 1942 to February 1945, now Freddie Mills had a professional record at this point with 66 wins, 12 defeats and 6 draws before spending 15 months out of the ring as World War II was finally coming to an end. And it ended obviously in September of 45. And on his return to the ring and without a single warm-up fight, Ted Broadrib matched Freddie with the American world light heavyweight champion Gus Levnich, who was 54, 10 and 5 at the time. Now, it was a horror show for Freddie, and you can see this fight. He was actually put down 4 times in the second round and twice in the 10th before the referee finally stopped the fight. And in between those troublesome rounds, Freddie did fight well. He showed great courage and earned huge respect. He even earned the respect of another boxing promoter and Mafia associate, who was Benny Huntsman. Now, we'll go into the story with Freddie and Benny later on. The next day, Freddie spoke of the fight, and he said, Lesnovich must have a ridiculous right hand because this morning I woke up with quite the headache. Now, although Freddie said this in a joking way, it was Frank Butler, a boxing writer and friend, that said Freddie had told him in strict confidence that he was never the same fighter after this first fight with Lesnovich. After that, I was getting headaches continuously, said Freddie. I think that I have had a very mild brain damage.
Wow. So even at this point in time, before we get even deeper down the rabbit hole of the Freddie Mills story, he's already admitting there that, you know, he thinks he's got mild brain damage, or he's had mild brain damage. Now, obviously, we're going back to the 1940s here, so the technology around at the time was nowhere near as advanced, so they weren't able to just go and do these scans so freely as they was in this day and age, and it wasn't as linked to the effects of CTE and brain damage boxing as it is in this day and age. So it's quite scary to think at this point in time he knows himself there's something not quite right, but yet there's nothing really that he can do about it. Now, maybe with the fear that he may need to retire early, as he continued to suffer with them recurring headaches, Mills actually began to invest in properties, acquiring several houses and flats. And in 1946 he opened the Freddie Mills Chinese restaurant at 143 Charing Cross Road as a joint venture with Charles Luck and actor Andy Ho. Now, Freddie fought 11 times following his world title challenge, winning 8 and losing 3, until he was given another title shot and rematch with Gus Lesnovich, who at this time was 60, 11 and 5, at the White City Stadium in London on the 26th of July 1948. Now, it would be Freddie's defining night in the boxing ring in front of 46,000 adoring fans. Lesnovich, who was the betting favourite, suffered from cuts over both eyes from the opening round as Mills started in his usual quick fashion. and the fight then settled down into a bit of a dull affair, which drew boos from the crowd and saw both men warned by referee Teddy Walton for the lack of action. Now in the 10th round, Mills actually rallied and floored Lesnovich heavily on 2 occasions, but Lesnovich responded with a savage attack in the 12th and 13th rounds, only for Mills to come back in the last 2 rounds. At the end of 15 rounds, Freddie Mills was awarded the decision by the referee, becoming the world light heavyweight champion.
And people have spoke, again, I allude to, there's a couple of documentaries, there's one on there, there's a chap on there who describes the feeling, and even when he speaks about the feeling of this fight, you know, he can't quite contain his emotions. This was a massive event, you know, from the war. I think this was the biggest, or one of the first sort of biggest events, sporting events after the war. So, you know, those 46,000 fans that are at the stadium, they must, you know, it must have been just an unbelievable atmosphere at White City Stadium. So on the 30th of April 1948, Mills married Chrissy at Herne Hill Methodist Church. In a funny story, her former husband remained close with the newlyweds, and they even stayed with McCorkindale on their honeymoon in South Africa, which I found was really quite interesting. It's a funny one, isn't it? So Mills was set to defend his title against Lesnovich in a rubber match scheduled for September in New York, but the fight was cancelled due to Mills suffering severe headaches and bouts of dizziness. Now in August, medical opinion was sought, and he was diagnosed with a misaligned vertebrae at the base of the skull. But, you know, today I think that would be the end of your career, but disturbingly, it was approved by doctors, funny enough, after just 2 months rest and spinal treatment, that he was able to return back to boxing.
Well, this is straight away gives you them warning signs to think this is the darker side of boxing. This is a story that's pretty grim. Anybody that already knows this story kind of knows where we're going with it. Anybody that doesn't, well, I think you get the gist of where this is going to go. So he was given the all clear by the doctors to basically go back and take more blows to the head. And that's what we're saying here. Now, in 1949 of September, a contract was signed for Mills to defend his world title against American Joey Maxim on January the 24th, 1950 at Earl's Court in London. Now, in a bad move, Mills went into the fight without his long-time trainer Nat Sellers and decided to train himself for the fight. Now, in usual style, Mills made a fast start but began to fold under the pressure from then on, with the fight turning into a one-sided beating. Maxim knocked out 3 of Freddie's teeth in the 7th, with one actually being embedded into the gum of his upper jaw before he was floored with a left-right combination in the 10th. Mills took the count in a sitting position before falling sideways and being counted out in what was an absolute beatdown. That was, for me, straight away when you watch that fight, you look back on the fight on the internet and you see how much of a beating he got. It was quite evident at this point he should never have been in the ring for that fight. He shouldn't have took that fight. However, it was Joey Maxim, massive name at that particular period of time, and the money was probably really good at that particular time for him to take that fight and defend that title. So understandably, that part of his brain's telling him, let's take the money, and not even thinking about the long-term effects that this particular fight could have on him. But that's pretty brutal how that ended.
It was murderous. It literally was. He absolutely bashed him. Let's get it right. Mills was in no fit state to ring. He did get absolutely pounding. But the fact when you described his teeth getting embedded into the upper jaw, and he still fights on for another 3 rounds before the referee stops it, it does sort of just tell you a story about Mills. And when you do watch Mills and his style, he is aggressive, but he takes a lot of hits to the head. A lot. You know, defensive skills were not what Mills was all about. So the next day after the overwhelming defeat to Joe Maxim, Broadrip announced that Freddie had decided to retire. A decision made formal on the 15th of February 1950 when he wrote to the British Boxing Board of Control to confirm his retirement and relinquishment of the British, European and Empire light heavyweight titles, aged only 30. Now, Freddie had become a huge celebrity figure when he won that world title. but his fame his fame continued. Into retirement. Now, to put his stardom into context for people that did not know Freddie Mills, I mean, this guy was as famous as David Beckham. This guy was huge. He was everywhere. He was loved by a nation. After the war, I know we're talking sort of, that long after, so you can understand it. And he epitomised, as we said, Great Britain. And not long after retirement, Freddie became the manager of Brixton heavyweight Terry O'Connor. Now, this is the same Terry O'Connor that we now know is an established referee today, which I thought was quite funny. I never knew that. And during that year, Freddie published his autobiography, which was called 20 Years. In 1951, he gained a promoter's license and put on many successful events until the mid-1950s while making various television appearances. He went on the television show Rooftop Rendezvous. Is that right? He actually commentated on Dennis Powell and Mel Brown card in Birmingham, which was broadcast on the BBC. He was given a 12-week Saturday radio show on the BBC. Made his first appearance in a program in a film, called Emergency Call, and he actually went on to make several small roles within several films, and again alongside some of the biggest stars in acting as well. This, it was just his name was getting him this endless pot of work, and he was loved. They absolutely loved him, quite simply.
Now, Freddie and Chrissy went on to have two daughters during the 50s. Susan Mahaya, born the 17th of June 1952, and Amanda Christine Elizabeth, born the 12th of June 1958. Freddie became a presenter on the BBC pop music programme 6-5 Special in February 1957 until he was dropped from the show in March of 1958, although he returned for the final show at the end of the year. By the early 60s, his television appearance had become less frequent, and by 1963, the Chinese restaurant that he opened a few years earlier was no longer profitable. Now, there are a couple of contrasting reasons as to why Mills and Ho converted the restaurant into a nightclub called, ironically, Freddie Mills Night Spot. Firstly, his stepson, Donnie, said Freddie made the decision himself, but in Michael Litchfield's book, The Secret Life of Freddie Mills, he says that he was influenced by the Kray twins. Litchfield said that the Kray twins paid Freddie a visit and took him to one of their nearby snooker halls. They advised him to turn the basement of the premises into a nightclub. Now, normally, advice from the Krays means go and do it, or you're dead. But being boxing fanatics, as we know him, and keen admirers of Freddie, this was just a piece of friendly advice, so to speak, for him. Now, they were rumoured to have told him, "You've nothing to fear from us, we'd never hurt you, and when others hear you have us for pals, then you're armour-plated." This was something that Freddie repeated to his friends on a regular basis.
Yeah, and it was the fact that he was a bit punch-drunk as well at this point. I think that's why he probably lost some of that appeal from the television companies. He just wasn't on the TV enough, and obviously that people said he repeated himself quite regularly. So this was a story that pretty much is confirmed, that he would always tell people that he had the Krays, and the Krays were going to help him. Some people, I think, felt that it was for him to sort of give them money, but by the sounds of it, he may always made it out to sound like they were friends. And as I say, I suppose it was just his part trick to always mention to everyone that was the case. Again, probably a sign of the brain damage. Now, the following year, 1964, Freddie was nominated by Andy Ho and second by musician Judd Solo to be initiated into the Chelsea Lodge number 3098, which was a Freemasons lodge for entertainers, where they would meet formally 5 times a year for ritual ceremonies. On the night that Freddie enlisted as a member, comedian Bob Monkhouse was there, and he was one of the first to congratulate him and becoming a fellow brother. Now, Mills became friendly with Monkhouse, and he was actually quoted in James Morton's book, which was called The Gangland Soho, when asked about the famous boxer. And this is in Bob Monkhouse's own words from this book. Excuse me. Now, Freddie had a very dark side. Freddie had male companions, and he also consulted with a number of ladies on a casual basis. He'll try anything. With some people, when they become famous, they feel the right to have anything they want. Excuse me. I didn't see him do it, but the story was that Freddie Mills was quite capable of whipping it out, as in his dick, and saying, wrap a big smile around that. He'd expose himself in front of anybody.
Oh, just imagine going to a night out and Freddie Mills comes up to the table, famous boxer, famous light heavyweight champion, British champion, all the rest of it. You're Bob Monkhouse, you're a comedian, you know all these other celebrities. Freddie Mills comes up to the table, whips his dick out on the table and says, wrap a big smile around that. You can just picture the scenes, literally, this guy just whipping it out on the table, absolutely mental. So this is now the point where we start to get even deeper into the story of Freddie Mills, literally, when he whips his dick out on tables. Now, this story was repeated by Mandy Rice Davis, who was actually a cabaret singer at Freddie's night spot, and she was heard to have said it was huge enough to choke a woman. Now, Mandy was interviewed by Litchfield when he was working for the Sunday Express about another topic, but attentions turned to Freddie, and she said there was definitely something sinister and even frightening about Freddie. In addition to being a rather lovable rogue, in fact, I'd go further, he was dangerous, and that appeals to women. Well, to me. They were not involved in an affair, but they did indulge in sexual activities. And Mandy went on to say, he got off on oral sex over and over. He was also pretty rough with it too. Towards the end, each time he got a wee bit too out of control, gripping my head with both hands, shuddering like he was having some sort of spasm and not letting me go. I ended up gasping for air, but the third occasion was enough for me. Now, you might be wondering why we've gone into such graphic detail on the subject, but the reasons will become more poignant later on in this particular story.
Yeah, so I think we're getting the gist of Freddie's obviously not quite well. You know, he obviously wants to expose himself a lot, and a really graphic story. That it is a graphic story in general. So, as you say, Phil, we will obviously explain why we've mentioned that. Now, there was an embarrassment of rumours as well about Freddie, but one that did have some substance came from various sources. Now, that was that Freddie was bisexual. Some believe that he had a homosexual affair with a singer called Michael Holiday, as well as paying for sex with numerous female prostitutes. Now, there was also a rumour that he was the lover of Ronnie Kray, one of the Kray twins. I'm sure many of us know that he was homosexual, but shortly before he died, Ronnie quashed any rumours concerning Mills' sexuality, according to his then wife, Kate Kray. Ronnie and Freddie were very good friends. I asked Ron about that before he died, and he told me that there wasn't a shred of truth. He said that Freddie was a real man's man, and that he wasn't that way inclined. Yeah. So, although in today's society being bisexual is not a crime, obviously not, this was during this time in the 60s, and anyone basically caught participating in homosexual activities would be sentenced to prison. That was the law. There have been accusations before 1967, when the Sexual Offences Act was lifted, that Freddie had fallen victim to the bent police officers, who was Wally Virgo, who was the commander of the Serious Crime Squad, and Kenneth Drury, who was the head of the Flying Squad. Now, they had twice caught Freddie in public lavatories embarking on acts of indecency with youths. But the corrupt duo would basically make that paperwork disappear for a charge, of course, and they continued to blackmail Freddie for his illegal at the time, although, you shouldn't really be doing any sexual activities in public, but, it was obviously, he didn't want anything like this to come out. So his life lifestyle was being blackmailed for it, and to the point where his investments had now vanished. So those investments in properties that he had gone, and he even went to the extent of having to remortgage his and Chrissy's home to keep his secret hidden. And this is all circumstantial evidence with no comprehensive verification to it, but from the sources that you read from online and everywhere else, I can sort of believe that most of this is probably true, in my opinion.
You got to think back to that period of time, Johnston, where obviously corruption was rife, police forces, backhanders, blackmail, it was all rife. In America, they had the mob. In the UK, they had their version of the mob. Ganglands like the Kray twins were very prominent at this period of time. So it's not something that's far-fetched whatsoever. Although it's not verified information, it is all circumstantial evidence that various journalists and authors have reported on in various books. So we decided to put this information in because if it's already out there in the public domain, there's quite a lot of people that obviously believe that to an extent a lot of this was true, of course. Now we move into another story about a mystery death, and on Sunday, July the 18th, 1965, around 10 p.m. or 10 a.m?
Yeah, I don't know. He just says around 10. And this is, by the way, this is Mills' death. I've put mysterious death, but it's Mills' death. Just
Right,
to throw that in.
Okay, so I'll start that bit again. So now we're going to move into the mysterious death of Freddie Mills and how everything came about. So we've given you a bit of context to what his lifestyle was like, but now we are going to go right into the nitty-gritty of the episode. We're going to talk about the death of Freddie Mills. On Sunday, July the 18th, 1965, reported at around 10, Mills drove to the home of the Kray twins in the East End for a social visit, but what was discussed has never been released, nor has there been a police record that supports this particular story that we're about to tell. Just a verbal conversation between Litchfield and his police source, Bob Berry, aka Jack. The same source witnessed Freddie drive to the home of Mrs. Mary Gladys Ronaldson at 316 Queenstown Road in Battersea in the southwest of London a week later, on the morning of Friday the 23rd of July. Now, Mrs. Ronaldson was an old friend of Freddie's and ran an amusement arcade in the Battersea Fun Fair. After they had a cup of tea, he left carrying something long and slim wrapped in brown paper. He was carrying a .22 caliber automatic rifle, one of those made up the armoury of Mrs. Donaldson's shooting range at the fun fair. Now he promised he'd return it on the Sunday afternoon.
Now, as testified by his two daughters, Susie and Amanda, they were allowed to stay up on that Friday night, in that Friday evening, basically because they pestered their mum. They wanted to watch the Beatles, who were appearing on the Morecambe Wire show, a big show at the time. And Freddie had basically helped convince Chrissy to allow him to stay up and watch it. So, for the family, Freddie was in good spirits. The next morning, it was a roasting hot day and the kids were happily playing in the garden with Freddie messing around with them. They were happily playing with his kids. Now, around 4 p.m, as in this is Litchfield states, his account, that Mills went down for a nap because he was actually recovering from a bout of pneumonia. Now, when he awoke, Chrissy was surprised that he wanted to go, considering he had been unwell. He was still recovering, but he wanted to go out. He wanted to go to the club. Now, considering obviously not well, she was trying to convince him stay there. He weren't interested. She actually asked him to stay at home, and his daughter Amanda actually remembers pleading with him. She remembers his Beatles night. It was a big thing. So it's always something that stuck in her mind. And she said, "Oh, Daddy, please don't go. Please stay here tonight." She said it wasn't like a premonition. It was just something that happened. And but Freddie was adamant. He was not going to be persuaded. So Chrissy told him that she would be along later to have their dinner at the club, as they did every fortnight.
Now, at 10:30 p.m. on Saturday the 24th of July, 1965, Freddie left his family at home and headed to his nightclub in Soho, London. And by 11:45 p.m, Freddie Mills was dead in his car, which was parked on Goslet Yard near the night spot. Mills, aged 46, was slumped forward on the back seat. The driver's side window was wound down, and he'd been shot through the right eye with a single bullet from a .22 caliber rifle. The rifle was leaning against the driver's back seat, well away from Mills, and the butt of the rifle was actually resting on the floor. Now, Don McCorkindale arrived at the club with his wife, Kate, and Chrissy at around 12:45 a.m. for their fortnightly ritual, and immediately saw Freddie's silver Citroen DS19 parked on Goslet Yard, with Freddie sitting in the back seat. Now, Don recalled, "I walked round into the darkness. I opened the door and I hit him on the knee and said, 'Come on, Fred. Come on, time to get up.' There was a goblet of blood that had concealed, and it was hanging out of his eye. And I went, bang, he's dead." Chrissy also recalled the horrific ordeal as well, and she said, "I opened the door to get into the car, and I can't get close enough to him because there was something between us. I turned around and I screamed at Donnie, 'There's a gun! Get the police! Get a bleeding ambulance!' And just over 2 hours later..."
Sorry.
It's all right. I'll go for that again. I just wanted to finish that last paragraph off.
Yeah, no, go, because I was just about to just it's tragic, but go on, no, do it.
Just over 2 hours later, and Mills was pronounced dead at Middlesex Hospital. Bizarrely, the paramedics who were called by the doorman... I'll start that again, sorry, I've read it the wrong way. Just over 2 hours later... Just over 2 hours later, and Mills was pronounced dead at Middlesex Hospital. Bizarrely, the paramedics were called by the doorman because he noticed something wrong removed from Freddie. I can't even read it right. 1 second.
Bizarrely, the paramedics were called by the doorman. Yeah, because he noticed something wrong. Yeah, what the hell's going on there? So,
I'll start.
Right, see, this is... Bizarrely, the paramedics were called by the doorman. This is wrong, that's why, because he noticed... Right, yeah, so... I think it's basically what I'm saying. What I was trying to say is, what happened was the doorman called the police, the ambulance. Sorry, maybe just forget about the doorman.
Right.
Basically, bizarrely, the paramedics were called but when they arrived, what happened was they basically removed Freddie from the car without. They got there and took him out of the car. So, and that was it. It was a crime scene. He was blatantly dead, but they just, for some reason, that's why I've just completely cocked that one up. But
fine.
yeah, that's basically
fine.
what happened.
I'll start again with it. Now,
Forget the doorman thing.
Okay, that's fine. So I'll go. So it was just over 2 hours later, and Freddie Mills is pronounced dead at the Middlesex Hospital. Now, what was bizarre about this incident was obviously the fact that he'd been found dead in the car. The gun was at one side of the car. You know, his eye had been shot through. Blood was hanging out of him. But what was even more strange about it was that when paramedics actually turned up to see to him, they'd actually removed him from the car, which at this point he's already dead, and that is a crime scene. But yet they actually removed him from the crime scene and took him to the hospital. Now, it was pretty evident from Donnie and Chris's description that they both knew he was dead. So why would he even be taken to the hospital? Why would they then just not confirm he's dead and then let the police and forensic investigators to come and scale the crime scene? Even more curiously, no police ever arrived at the scene before Freddie was removed.
It's a strange one. They've arrived. You can clearly see from the descriptions that you read earlier with Donnie and Chrissy, they knew he was dead. As you say, paramedics would normally check the pulse. He's dead. Now, the fact he's got this blood coming out of his eye, it is a crime scene. Anyone today, there's no way they would just remove him. He would sit there, they would call the police, they'd wait for the police, they'd be told to go, basically, not after the police would arrive. But the fact they just took him from the car, stuck him in the ambulance, and went off to the hospital, no police even there. It's bizarre. It really is a very strange thing to do. And now, to add to the mystery, Freddie was shot through the left eye, which is a very peculiar place to shoot yourself. When investigating suicide by a gun, many victims take their own lives by shooting themselves in the forehead or through the mouth, but never the eye. I mean, the only time someone ends up dead by being shot through the eye is if someone else is pulling the trigger. And Professor David Wingate, who was a resident medical officer at Middlesex Hospital, and he was on call at the time. And when Freddie's body basically arrived in the hospital, and he examined it, and he said, in his own words, because he wasn't shot through his eyelid, it meant that his eye was open when he was shot. If you were to shoot yourself, you would look down the muzzle of the gun. But the moment you squeeze that trigger, you would shut your eye. In Professor Wingate's professional opinion, he said, I think he was looking down the barrel of that gun, someone else was holding it. And to make things even more puzzling was that Professor Wingate was not present at the coroner's inquest and was never called to give evidence. Wingate actually said himself that he just got the impression that they did not want to make a fuss.
So at this point in time, you're starting to think to yourself, Johnston, that this is more than just a suicide. This is conspiracy. This is murder. This is exactly what this points to straight away. Now, Detective Inspector Harold Walton took charge, announcing that it was now a murder investigation, and Goslet Yard, the nightclub, and the Citroen were crime scenes. Well, Mr. Walton, it was a little bit too late at that point because his body had already been removed from the crime scene, which had contaminated the crime scene. So straight away you're thinking to yourself, all right, well, this is what you're dealing with. Now, there must have been a major breakdown in communication, or Harold, of course, wasn't handed that memo in time, because Professor Keith Simpson, who conducted the post-mortem, stated that the shot had penetrated the skull and the brain with no exit hole, and concluded that there was nothing from the medical examination of this wound or of the body generally to give cause for suspicion of foul play. The wound shows nothing out of keeping with deliberate self-infliction. The curiosity just doesn't stop there, because the police evidenced that a second bullet hole was found on the Citroen's car chassis, and the inquest speculated that Mills was just practicing, which, again, you find very, very strange. So you've got one professor who's essentially saying that there's no possible way that he killed himself because of the way the injuries were inflicted. And then you've got somebody else who's done a post-mortem, Professor Keith Simpson, who's now saying it's a suicide.
It's a strange one, and the fact that the Detective Inspector Harold Walton made it a crime scene, announced it as a crime scene, I believe in front of the press as well. So then, I mean, he must have looked like a right idiot. Let's get it right. And what the hell? Why wasn't? There's just too many problems with this, and the fact that he's even announced it as a crime scene, and as you say, they've just come in and taken a body. I mean, that's the main point of a flipping crime scene. Well, anyway, the news of Freddie's death became public knowledge, and basically everyone was in shock. Nobody could believe that such a huge star had been shot dead and surrounded in such mystery, and it was big news, with the public's opinion basically split, and the media between murder and suicide. And now, Professor Brian J. Ford, who was actually sent the bare minimum of evidence, he was the guy that he would... Let me start again. Professor Brian J. Ford was sent a bare minimum of evidence by a couple of journalists and various other sources to investigate as an outsider. Now, still to this day, Professor Brian Ford is still puzzled by the case, with the verdict still confirmed as suicide by the coroner, with the additional reasons being that he had borrowed the gun from a friend, as we spoke about earlier, and the fact that he was suffering with depression. So that was their other spin on things. That's why they said he definitely committed suicide. And Freddie's family refused and still refused to accept the verdict. Susie, Freddie's daughter, said, "My mother was very angry with the verdict. She always said that he was murdered." And Chrissy herself said, "I think if he had taken his own life, he would have left a note, some kind of explanation. I'm sure of it." And then Freddie's other daughter, Amanda, agreed with her mother. She said it was totally out of character. He loved life. He loved his family. He loved everything to do with life. He was not a quitter. You don't become a world champion and quit, do you?
Professor Brian Ford was amazed that the police were so quick to conclude that Freddie had borrowed the gun to kill himself rather than borrow it to protect himself. He was in a lot of debt at this time, and it was common knowledge that he'd aligned himself to the criminal underworld, as we talked about earlier on with the story of the Krays. Therefore, Professor Brian Ford had a different theory to how Freddie died that makes a little bit more sense when analysing the crime scene. Now, he says, Freddie sits in his car, somebody approaches, taps on the window, and he opens the window. There's a struggle. The guy grabs Freddie's gun, the gun goes off, and makes a hole in the door of the car. The guy then points the gun at his eye, and bang, he shoots him. The eye is blown out, and the guy puts the gun down strategically to give the impression of suicide. So, you've got all these different professors, 3 of them, in fact, involved in this. 2 of them point to the fact that this is murder, with 1 of them pointing to the fact this is suicide. So, who do you go with here at this point in time? Now, it makes it quite interesting because, of course, you start to really think this is murder. Everybody in his family thinks it's murder. And I think it's a good way to move into what potentially were the motives for murder.
Yeah, so there were 2 prominent crime families in the 60s that ruled London's murky underbelly. One was obviously the Krays and the other being the Richardsons from South London, who had managed to take hold of Soho during the time of Freddie's death. Now, they were known to torture their victims. Quite simply, they were very unsavoury fellas with links to organised crime in the West End, and many theorised that the Richardsons did not hold Freddie Mills in the same light as the Kray twins. So quite simply, if they killed Freddie, there wouldn't be a second thought of it. And to give you insight into the type of guys they were, Eddie Richardson's actually spoke on this BBC documentary that is on YouTube, and he actually says, when I came home after my first sentence, I was a bad boy in prison. I lost 140 days remission. I was in mutiny in Durham, tied up a couple of screws, and tried to escape. All sorts of skullduggery, he said. Eddie made it clear that back then, if someone took a liberty, they got their comeuppance. He then went on to speak of Freddie, and he said, I remember Freddie Mills. He was a hero of mine at the time when I was younger. Now, when he was actually asked by the guy who was casting the interview, he was asked that people believe, and they speculated that Richardsons were involved, with it being Eddie or Charlie, whoever, in Freddie's death. And he come back and he said, rubbish. I think he committed suicide. He had had enough of it, for whatever reason. And he just went, hey, I've said enough, and that was about it. It did seem quite a sinister. I think the Richardsons and the Krays both were. I don't know, I've got the impression that I don't think it would be the Richardsons, that's my opinion, but they were speculated as potential suspects.
Now, next, we have the Kray twins, of course, who we've spoke about quite heavily in this episode, who, at this time, were beginning to make their way. I'll start again. Next, we had the Kray twins, who we've heavily spoke about in this episode, who were beginning to make their way into the West End. They had influences in the boxing circle and in the showbiz world, and of course they knew Freddie really well, advising him on the nightclub. Or did they advise him on the nightclub? Did they offer to assist for no return just because they like Freddie? Now, many believe that the twins were heavily involved in Freddie Mills' death. Some believe that Freddie was murdered by authorization of the Krays because he owed them protection money. But Michael Litchfield in his book has a different reason as to why the Krays were involved in his death, and he wrote, Freddie's death was suicide by proxy, murder by appointment, and self-financed. Yes, Mills paid a hitman to kill him, but he couldn't bring himself... Right, I'll start that again, because I've just read it wrong. I know what it says. Freddie's death was suicide by proxy, murder by appointment, and self-financed. Yes, Mills paid a hitman to kill him because he couldn't bring himself to do it himself. When Freddie went to see the Krays, he told them he's decided he could not take no more of this crappy life, which had become a living hell for him. Now, Litchfield also went on to write that the Krays thought he was on a wind-up, but when they realised he was serious, They said they knew a man who would do it for a price and quoted $1,000. The man for the job was Jimmy Moody, a 24-year-old wannabe Mafia-style hitman. Freddie was told to leave the rifle in the boot of his Citroen. Only the time, date and place remained a mystery.
Well, again, I mean, that sounds fascinating. I mean, what an interesting version of events. Very possible. Again, very, very possible. We mentioned the fact earlier he went to see the Krays. We'll go into who witnessed why he went. Not why, no one knows why, but he did go a week before his death. So maybe he did go there and agree with them. Now, on the counter claims for this theory was Detective Nipper Reid, and he was the man responsible for bringing down the Krays in 1966 World Cup final day. And Chrissy actually asked Leonard Nipper Reid to investigate the Krays' involvement in her husband's death, but there was no evidence that the Krays or any person was demanding protection money from Mills. Nipper Reid did comment on Freddie's death, and he did say there would have been some kind of rumour on the underworld that Freddie Mills was set up for the example. And in fact, amongst other club and restaurant owners, the finger would be pointed. In other words, they would say, if you don't listen and you basically do what you're told, otherwise this is what's going to happen to you. Look at Freddie Mills kind of thing. That was basically what he was getting at. But he said this was never the case. That sort of evidence and intelligence just never seeped back. So for him, the Krays, and he looked, I mean, he was the guy that put them down, for being sake. So, he knew them like anything. Like when you see in the movies and when you read books and watch documentaries, the detective that's chasing the guy is almost the twins. He would have been fascinated, every minute of his day would have been trying to get these two. So any little niggle of any of the evidence anywhere, if anyone was going to know, you would think it would be Nipper Reid. So, interesting.
It does make you wonder, doesn't it? But then again, when you speak about the detective earlier on who had announced that there was a crime scene after the body had already been removed, it really does make you think what the police were doing at the time. However, obviously Nipper Reid is well known for bringing down the Krays at that particular period of time. Now, these two conspiracy theories are more than believable, considering how dangerous and unpredictable both of them crime families were. But what about the motives for suicide? Why would Freddie Mills want to kill himself? Maybe his sexuality had become too much of a burden to live with, or his financial troubles tipped him over the edge. But the evidence from the crime scene and the puzzling turn of events from the paramedics, coroner and police does suggest murder. But the next conspiracy may explain it all.
Yeah, so we're gonna start with something here. So we're going to just drift off the Mills subject for a moment. Now, this is to do with the Hammersmith nude murders. Now, here's a brief explanation on a series of the 6 murders that happened 56 years ago in West London from 1964 to 1965. Now, the victims, all prostitutes, were found undressed in or near the River Thames, leading the press to nickname the killer Jack the Stripper. Now, we're going to just run through the 6 victims here. So I'll start the first 3. So the victims were as follows. So Hannah Talford, who was age 30, was found dead on the 2nd of February 1964 at the Thames foreshore below Linden House, west of the Hammersmith Bridge. She had been strangled, several of her teeth were missing, and her underwear was actually stuffed in her mouth. Irene Charlotte Lockwood, aged 25 years old, was found dead on the 8th of April 1964 on the foreshore of the Thames on Corney Reach, Chiswick, not far from where Talford had been found. Lockwood was pregnant at the time of her death. Helen Catherine Barthélemy, aged 22, the young Scottish girl, was found dead on the 24th of April 1964 in the alleyway of the rear of the 199 Boston Manor Road, Brentford. Barthelemy's death gave investigators their first solid piece of evidence in the case, the flecks of paint used in the car manufacturing. Police felt that the paint had probably come from the killer's workplace. They therefore focused on tracing it to a business nearby.
Now, the next three victims were, first of all, Mary Fleming, aged 30, who was found on July the 14th, 1964, outside 48 Berrymead Road in Chiswick. Once again, paint spots were found on the body. Many neighbours had also heard a car reversing down the street just before the body was discovered. Then there was Francis Brown, at age 21, who was last seen alive on October the 23rd, 1964, by a colleague who saw her get into a client's car. On November 25th, the body was found in a car park on Hornsey Street, Kensington. She'd been strangled. The colleague was able to provide police with an identification picture and a description of the car thought to be a grey Ford Zephyr. Brown had testified as a witness for the defence, along with Christine Keeler and Mandy Rice Davis, at the trial of Stephen Ward, who was one of the central figures in the 1963 Profumo affair, a British political scandal which brought about the resignation of John Profumo, the Secretary of State for War. And the third victim was Bridget, aka Brady O'Hara. Now, she was an Irish immigrant who was found dead on the 16th of February 1965 near a storage shed behind the Heron Trading Estate. She'd been missing since the 11th of January. Once again, O'Hara's body turned up flecks of industrial paint which were traced to an electrical transformer near to where she was discovered.
So they're the 6 victims. 2 earlier murders were actually committed in 1959 and 1963. Now, they've also been linked by some investigators to being the same perpetrator. And the names are, again, Elizabeth Figg was found dead on the 17th of June 1959 by police officers on a routine patrol in Dukes Meadows, Chiswick, on the north bank of the River Thames. Figg's body was found approximately 200 yards from Barnes Bridge. Her dress was torn at the waist and open to reveal her breasts. Marks around her neck were consistent with strangulation, and Figg's underwear and shoes were missing.
And Gwyneth Reeves was found on November the 8th, 1963, at a dump site which was situated 40 years from the Thames towpath and approximately 1 mile from Duke's Meadows. Reeves was naked except for a single stocking on her right leg. She had been accidentally decapitated by a shovel which workmen had been using to level the refuse. Now, despite intense media interest and one of the biggest manhunts in Scotland Yard's history, the case is actually still unsolved. All forensic evidence gathered at the time is believed to have been destroyed or lost. So, you're probably asking yourself the question at this point, what does this have to do with the case of Freddie Mills? So, we're looking at a motive for suicide now. 6 suspects have been identified among several sources within the police force, but nothing has been confirmed. Freddie Mills had been identified as one of the suspects on this particular list. And in 2001, reformed gangster Jimmy Tippett Jr. said that during research for his book about London's gangland, he had uncovered information suggesting that Freddie Mills was responsible for the murders. And Tippett said, "I have spoken to famous figures in the underworld and senior police officers in Scotland Yard, and I'm convinced Freddie Mills was the killer. Contrary to his public image, Mills was a sexually warped sadist who enjoyed inflicting pain." According to Tippett, the Krays, Charlie Richardson and Frankie Fraser had long suspected Mills of being the murderer. Mills had also been previously linked with the murders by Peter Neal, a freelance journalist from Balham, South London, who told police in July 1972 that he had received information in confidence from a serving chief inspector that Mills killed the nude prostitutes. He also said that this was common knowledge in the West End. Many people would say, "Oh, Freddie did them."
My goodness me. This is taking a crazy, crazy turn, and this is what we're talking about. It's like an onion. The layers of it just kept coming, and this is where we go into it. Now, the suggestion that Freddie was Jack the Stripper actually originated from the gangster, as you mentioned, Frankie Fraser, who gave his opinion to a certain policeman who we've also mentioned, as in Jack, and he was the source for the Sun crime reporter, Michael Litchfield. And this gives the most compelling of conspiracy theories of them all. Fraser claimed that the story was confessed by Freddie Mills to Scotland Yard Chief Superintendent, and his name was John DeRose, and told by DeRose to Frankie Fraser. But when DeRose actually published his autobiography, which touched on the Hammersmith murders, there was no mention of Freddie Mills with regards to the case. Litchfield claims conclusively that he lied before taking any evidence or knowledge to the grave of him.
Wow. This just gets even darker, deeper, and some might say it's quite a far-fetched claim as well. But nothing is out of the window with this particular story, and it goes on. Now, in the next segment, we would like to describe to you, the listener, the key allegations made by Michael Litchfield in his book, which is The Secret Life of Freddie Mills, national hero, boxing champion, serial killer. Now, we're going to read out several transcripts from within the book that will explain Litchfield's reasons for naming Freddie Mills as the serial killer. There are some critical alleged confessions in the public domain by singer Michael Holiday, who had a reported affair with Freddie, as we discussed earlier, and pianist Russ Conway, that gave immense circumstantial credence to what I heard years earlier from a pivotal and inviolate source, Jack. Now, Litchfield goes on to describe Mills and Holiday hiring prostitutes for sex parties in a mass orgy. And he says, the girls, for a brokered fee, had to be prepared to participate in sadomasochistic games, allowing themselves to be spanked, belted and tied up. When the two men got tired of that sequence of the party, is that right?
Yep.
Right, okay. When the two men got tired of that sequence of the party, they would then have sex with each other, while the girls egged them on and indulged in lesbian tricks. One of the requirements was for one of the girls to give Mills oral sex during the orgy, and it was at that moment that things turned even more sinister.
This is just crazy. This is just mad. Again, I mean, if you are offended by this, I probably should have said this earlier, should we? So, if you're offended by this,
disclaimer.
You can obviously skip it on. So, Holiday was reported to have repeated this. I've skipped. Sorry, hang on. Was I on the right line now?
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he was.
Okay, right, yeah. So, Holiday was reported to have repeated the horrifying version of events to two people, pop pianist Russ Conway and Dorothy Squires, who was actually married to Roger Moore. Now, he told these two that while involved in a threesome by this point, and this is again from Litchfield's book, again, if you don't want to listen to this, it's just crazy. Right, Mills was being over vigorous while enlarged in her, as in a prostitute's mouth. She gasped and her eyes shot up to her head, but Mills wouldn't stop. Holiday claimed to have endeavoured to pull him off, but Mills was beyond Rubicon, and she died.
Wow.
So during the panic, Holiday wanted to call the authorities, but Freddie convinced him not to, saying, if this gets out, we're both finished forever. Freddie said that he could dispose of the bodies in the Thames, but Holiday was horrified and left him to it. Obviously, Holiday would have been unnerved by the whole experience, and he sought advice from Conway, and Conway told him to leave Freddie. Now, there was a strong and emotional bond between these two men, and Freddie could be possessive and aggressive. Freddie promised to tone down the rough stuff, but when he was in a sexual fever, this is Jack's phrase, he couldn't restrain himself. and yet a second woman died. She too was dumped in the River Thames.
Oh my God, this is absolutely mental. If you've been listening to the series, this is probably the darkest and most graphic episode we've done so far, and maybe we should have put a disclaimer at the start of the episode. Oh, what the hell? I'm pretty sure you guys that listen to this podcast know what it's all about. This is absolutely brutal, and we'll go on further now and talk about what else Lichfield comes out with. Now, Lichfield answers the question that I'm sure you're all thinking. Why hadn't the killer been castrated? Surely the instinctive, self-defensive response by any woman having her windpipe blocked in such a grotesque fashion. The answer was that in each case, an instrument had been deployed to restrain the woman from being able to bite, and was the reason why a number of the victims had front teeth missing. Traces of semen were found in the victim's system, but being ladies of the night, of course, that would be quite common and not really easy to trace directly who that had come from. This did, however, trigger a police investigation aptly named Operation Deep Throat.
This is just, I mean, what the hell are they thinking calling it Operation?
I don't think you'd get away with that now.
Oh my goodness. Oh, I do apologise, but what the fuck? There's some seriously disorientated people that even thought about calling it Operation Deep Throat. My goodness me. Right, let me compose myself. Right, going back to Litchfield's book, this crazy book. Now, Holiday was so distressed that he decided he had two alternatives. Now, one of them was obviously to go to the police, tell the authorities what happened, or take his own life. He chose the latter. He overdosed. Litchfield claims that the police were able to link Freddie to the murders because of the Citroen registration number plate that had been logged several times in the red light zones of West London. But the police had no forensic evidence to clinch the case against Freddie. Now, in a counter statement, which was claimed by Dick Kirby, who was a former flying squad officer himself, and he was an author, he said that the car index that was held by the inquiry contained details of 300,000 vehicles, but none of the people who were involved or who were interviewed was Freddie Mills, and his vehicle was never among those that were logged. So you've got two conflicting statements there. I mean, do you believe Litchfield? Who knows? I mean, Holiday obviously killed himself. He takes that to the grave. Who knows whether any of this was legitimately true? What about the two people he told? It's just crazy. And then obviously we've got Detective Kirby, part of the flying squad, that basically said he was never ever a suspect. So you make your own mind up. Believe what you think you believe. It is just crazy. And it gets worse.
Now, Chief Superintendent John DeRose of Scotland Yard, the detective who was in charge of the case, believed that Freddie was now, in their words, ready to be caught. Litchfield's source, Jack, went to the night spot with a message for Freddie Mills. "Tell him we know," he informed Doorman Bob Deacon. When Freddie got the message, Jack and a team of officers followed him closely until DeRose received a call from Bob Monkhouse, who said that Freddie wanted a meeting with just the two of them. Now, apparently they met at a champagne bar in Great Queen Street. When Freddie arrived, he spoke of Virgo and Drury, the bent coppers that had rinsed him for all his money through blackmail about his secret sexuality. Eventually, they managed to arrive at the subject at hand. "We're here, Freddie, because of my message, right?" said DeRose. "You see, I'm aware of the much bigger story. Now's the time to unload. If I were you," after a long lingering pause, Freddie said, very self-consciously, "I never meant it to happen." And DeRose said, "What, Freddie?" "I didn't mean to kill any of them, not the first, not the last. I paid for it. Those women knew what they were doing. I didn't force them into anything they weren't prepared to do. They wanted the money. They just couldn't take it."
Well, right, Litchfield actually continues in his book, and he says Mills wasn't to know that the briefcase DeRose had with him was a specially adapted tape recorder. It's one of those ones where apparently it's like you'd see in the old Bond films where they flip the handle, and apparently when you flip the handle up, you record them, and you flick it down, it stops. Now, this would not be sufficient evidence to stand in court, and DeRose was fully aware that a confession wouldn't be sufficient for a conviction either. Now, he needed forensic evidence. So when Freddie asked DeRose for some time to get his house in order before handing himself into custody, he was actually granted 2 weeks respite, which actually, I believe he said 2 weeks in the book. He said 2 weeks, and DeRose said, no, a week and an hour, even 10 days or something. And they would follow Freddie from this point, and basically until the point he handed himself in, which obviously we know that it didn't happen. The other thing is, which it's not really anywhere, but this evidence, I suppose we mentioned it earlier, was destroyed evidence. Why was this evidence never come out? Why would DeRose ever have evidence that was recorded and not release it? Is it stuck somewhere in the middle of nowhere, or did it ever happen? So, again, more conspiracy theories. There's nothing concrete with any of this. It's just a guy that had a source called Jack.
I think what baffles the pair of us while investigating this episode for the Darker Side of Boxing is if Freddie Mills was under around-the-clock surveillance, why were they not on the scene straight away when Jimmy Moody killed Freddie, apparently, as Litchfield had indicated? It's a very intriguing, but it's a damning conspiracy theory that has damaged the reputation of Freddie Mills, and there are significant holes that would need to be filled to give this theory more grounds for people to believe it. Litchfield himself said he was convinced that Freddie was Jack the Stripper when writing the book, but has since wavered in his conviction to only 80% certain. The reason for the change of heart is because there are certain holes in the story that cannot be filled, and as Litchfield said in his own words, there is 20% margin for error. Another counter to this story comes from Dick Kirby, once again, who said that 1,700 men that tried to pick up prostitutes were spotted by police and questioned. 26 men were regarded as suspects at one time, but Freddie Mills was not one of them. Freddie Mills was never, ever considered a suspect. Plus, of course, we've got DeRose, who implicated a different suspect, Mungo Island, a security guard on an estate close to where the last body was found before Nipper Reid died of COVID-19 on April the 7th, 2020, 1 week after his 95th birthday. He's still... I've got that wrong. I'm going to start that again. I've missed a full stop.
That was me. I should have done another... Sorry, yeah, go
It's fine. No, I've missed the full stop. Don't worry. It's me that's missed it. I'm going to start from that plus bit. Plus, of course, DeRose, who implicated a different suspect named Mungo Island, a security guard on an estate close to where the last body was found. Now, before Nipper Reid died of COVID-19, only this year, on April the 7th, 2020, 1 week after his 95th birthday, he still remained convinced that Mills committed suicide and did not believe he was responsible for those murders. He claimed that confusion arose because the chief suspect, Mungo Island, was revealed to be a married man and former boxer in his 40s who had committed suicide in mid-1965.
So, I mean, that's the information we've given, we've sourced it, and we've put it in your ears. I mean, make what you will of it. The books are out there. There's more of it. There are other books that also say that Freddie was involved in these orgies and his homosexual situations. Again, it was the 60s. There's nothing wrong with that. The fact is I don't know. It baffles me. I mean, it just seems so far-fetched, doesn't it? The fact that he would suffocate these girls with his penis. I'll laugh because it's not funny, but it's fucking mad. It's just messed up. Excuse my language. So, right, we'll move on to the last theory then. Now, this is the very last theory in terms of what happened with Freddie Mills. And basically, if you think that we are done with all the conspiracies that loom over Freddie Mills, then you're basically mistaken. There is another story, and it's only very recently come to light in the last sort of 2 to 3 years because of certain figures that have perished. Roger Huntsman, the son of Benny, who we mentioned earlier, who had become a close friend of Freddie's since the Lesnovich fights. He had actually written a document that he religiously believes is what happened to Freddie Mills. And Roger said in the BBC documentary that Freddie laid a bet, and that bet was his life. I have no idea how long I am going to be alive. I'm 75 and I have diabetes. So let's get the story out.
Now, during the 60s, the American Mafia had begun dealings in London, with the casinos being their main target. Meyer Lansky was Lucky Luciano's right-hand man and was a gambling kingpin who, with his associates, had plans to turn the West End into a mini Las Vegas. It was Benny that moved to London as their point man in England and in Europe to start the crime business venture of rigging the casinos and fixing the odds for financial gain. Roger spoke of the operation, saying, "Everything was going swimmingly when all of a sudden Freddie Mills turned up." Roger said that Freddie went to his father's flat and explained that he was going under and he needed £2,500 to sort out his financial problems. He also threatened Benny by saying, "I know who you're working with, and if you don't give me the money, I'm going to Fleet Street," meaning the newspaper. It was basically a Cockney rhyming slang for newspaper. If indeed true, then blackmailing a Mafia associate and in the middle of bankrolling millions, he would certainly not allow someone like Freddie Mills to ruin it. Roger said that his dad had advised him to give Freddie a message that Benny would deliver the money personally on July the 25th.
So on the night in question, Roger was working at the tables in another club when his dad walked in around 4 a.m. in the morning. So it's actually into the next day with some old guy. He said an Italian American. A large bloke then walked over to his father and whispered in his ear. At this point, Benny then turned to the table and basically said Freddie was dead. He's gone. Roger recalled the moment. In his own words, he said, "This old guy had a look. No, this old guy had a smirk on his face. Later, I found out that it was Meyer Lansky. He was there on the night Mills was shot." So, I mean, there is nothing, again, I mean, this is his words. Meyer Lansky was in London, and again, it just gets even worse. It's just an incredible story, and I mean, yeah, I'll let you finish it off, Sean. It's crazy.
Well, interestingly, Benny was actually a close friend of Freddie's, but he never attended the funeral, and neither did Roger. To prove that he was telling the truth, Roger went one step further by meeting with Freddie's stepson, Donny, to tell him the full story face to face, and that's exactly what they did in their meeting in February 2018. And Johnston, as you said earlier about this story, this case, this story, this life and death of Freddie Mills, has been like an onion. Once we began to start peeling away from the surface, one layer after another, it's had so many twists and turns that it's actually hard to believe it's real at some points. I think even if this was to be made into a movie, it would seem quite far-fetched. I mean, look at all the different theories as surrounding what's actually happened. We've started from going to murder or suicide, to Freddie Mills being labelled Jack the Stripper, to Freddie Mills basically deep-throating prostitutes to the point that he was killing him and throwing him in the Thames, to the point that one of his partners then killed himself later on down the line. Now we've got the story of potentially being linked to the criminal underworld to the point that it was a Mafia hit because he was getting in the way and he was being Mr. Big Shot, as we've heard about in some of the other stories that we've told for the darker side of boxing. It's just unbelievable to think that some of these stories might actually be true and some of them might just be bullshit. It's really, really difficult to determine which one is true, and I think this is the point where most of the listeners, you'll be thinking, I wonder what these guys think about it. Well, I think it's our turn to kind of give our final assessment on this particular case and this story, because I'm pretty sure by this point you'll all be having your own interpretations of what you think happened. Now, this is my opinion. My opinion is that I think he was shot and he was killed. I don't know how. I don't know by who. I can't put my finger on it because there's not enough circumstantial evidence or evidence per se to actually pinpoint one particular person. What seems more logical to me is the final conspiracy theory, which we've just spoken about. That seems a more logical one. Maybe Meyer Lansky wasn't in London the night he was shot, but maybe one of his affiliates had someone do it for him. That's definitely not out of reach given the period of time that this happened in. But the far-fetched stories of him being Jack the Stripper, do I believe it? Elements of it can be believable because of some of the stories that we've heard. But I'm interested to know, like, what your opinion is on this and what your final verdict is. Do you think it was suicide? Do you think he killed himself because he was going to be outed as a homosexual? He was going to be outed for killing girls? Or do you think it was a case of he rubbed up the wrong person and he got shot and killed?
Yeah, I think he was murdered. I think when you hear some of the professors, we had 3 statements here, didn't we, Sean, with those professors, and I think the one that mentioned looking down a barrel of that gun and, you pull the trigger, you're going to shut your eye. The fact that he didn't have a hole in his eyelid, I think that clearly for me, I mean, who kills themselves by shooting themselves through the eye? I don't get that. I think he was definitely murdered. I mean, at first, when we was first doing all the investigation, I sort of felt that the Kray story at first with that guy Jimmy and him going to the Krays and then them sort of telling him to leave the rifle in the boot and someone would be along. I thought that sounded pretty possible because obviously he was. I'm not sure, but when I think about the Jack the Stripper story, it is so crazy and just so out there that I can't quite get my head around it and believe it. They. Looking into other documentaries and other sort of areas on the internet where you look into the sort of the Jack the Stripper, there is strong connections to the fact that these girls were murdered by somebody doing that as well, by actually with their penis. I mean, it's crazy, but it's possible because of the way they died and the way they all seemed to have drowned. Some of them hadn't drowned; they weren't even near the tent. So people thought they were suffocated. They were in a way. Does that mean it's Freddie Mills? No, not necessarily. I don't think he was the murderer. I don't think he was, personally. I believe there could have been a situation where something could have gone wrong in this orgy. I believe there definitely would have been orgies. The fact why did Holiday kill himself, I think we'll never know that. There must be a reason. I think that probably there is substance behind that. There could have been an accident. Doesn't make him the stripper. Jack the Stripper, but I think it means that maybe something went wrong and maybe someone did die. But he was murdered. I'm generally would like go with the last story because why on earth would Roger Huntsman, after all this time, come out and say that his dad basically was getting blackmailed by him and he murdered him? I think that is pretty damning. I think that would have happened for me. That is probably more logical. Why would a guy that had this mafia association his dad did, he was the pinpoint man in London and Europe. He was that guy. He lived here, For me, I think he was killed, and I think he was killed by the mafia.
Well, I'd like to know what the listeners have got to say on this. And again, it's been another damning, compelling, far-fetched, conspiracy theory-based stories that we've gone through in this episode, and it's been thrilling to go through, compelling, funny in parts, but not so funny in some parts. I mean, the funniest part of the whole story was the fact that the police dubbed it Operation Deep Throat when looking for Jack the Stripper, and I don't think I could ever get past the fact that a police force would even go to that extent. But the actual story itself, the story of a guy who was a national hero who was then dubbed by Michael Litchfield a serial killer. Now, that book is available to buy, and I would highly recommend that you do go and read the full book in its entirety. Now, whether this is, again, a guy that has got various sources who has been able to put this book together based on Chinese whispers, so to speak, is again debatable, but some of the information that we've sourced for it's been quite compelling. There's many documentaries out there on Freddie Mills, and I highly recommend that if you've not already watched any of the documentaries, that you do go and watch them, because they all actually give a different interpretation of Freddie Mills, and it does kind of lead you to believe and give you a certain perception of this character, of this person, of who he really was. So it's really, really compelling to have done the research for this particular episode. We hope that you've been sat there and you've kind of been gripped by the episode, because I don't think it's a story that many people think about when they think about true crime and they think about the mixture of true crime and boxing. And I think this has been one that we've really enjoyed doing, in the sense that it's a story that's not been told in this format ever. And this is why we've really enjoyed doing it. So although it's been grisly, although it's been dark, although there's been grim moments, some really sordid, graphic moments, it's been, for us, an enjoyable investigation, an enjoyable bit of research, and an absolutely unbelievably mental story to tell you guys, the listeners. Johnston, final thoughts on this secret life of Freddie Mills?
Yeah, it's just, the whole thing was just crazy. I've never known anything like it. I was lost for words, and then when you put it together, and then we sit here and discuss it and go through it. You're right, though. No one else has put it in this format. No one's ever really. You may watch, or if you're a book person, you'll pick up a book and you can read about Freddie Mills, and he will be shown in this perfect light, this happy-go-lucky, everybody loved him. But probably will touch on the homosexuality, bisexual stuff, and that I think was pretty true. And I think that was where it takes that dark twist. But you would watch something else, or you'll pick up a book on someone else, and you get the Litchfield story. You'll get his Jack the Stripper. He was this savage, aggressive person, a Jack the Lad. That sort of interpretation. And then when you hear his kids, Amanda and Susie, and how highly they speak of him, they say how loving he was. Again, you get yourself caught up into that, and you believe that maybe none of these stories are true. But how many times have we sat and watched and looked at crime and these evil people in this world, and how loving they are as family, as fathers or mothers? So there's so many different aspects, and I don't think, again, with certain individuals passing away, I think that's where you start getting that information. If this briefcase was true and this recording was true, I think that would be massively important. But where's that gone? It's just so many holes. The police I think that's why the Mafia were a big key part of it for me, because the paramedics and the way they got rid of the body and how poorly the police were, and the coroner were quick to say it's suicide. Only the Mafia could do that for me. So yeah, as a whole, it's just brilliant. I loved it. Sad story and crazy turns of events. Some that are really funny. We can't help but laugh about Operation Deep Throat. It's messed up, man. It's bad. You would never have Operation Deep Throat today. Yeah, that would stick with me forever. Terrible no. But it's tragic. It really was for the family. But what a brilliant dark side of boxing, though. Really was great episode.
Of course, if you guys have enjoyed listening to this particular episode, please go and let us know on social media, on Twitter at darker_side_pod. You can find us on the Facebook page, the BTR Boxing Podcast Network, where all our latest episodes of all the different series that we run are on there. Please go on Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating, leave us a review, let people know what you think of this series, of these episodes that we're putting out. Do you think they're awesome? Do you think they're alright? Let us know. Give us that rating. Give us that review. It truly helps get the word of mouth out about the darker side of boxing and the episodes that we put out there. If you're not on Apple and you're on an Android phone, go and find us on any available podcasting app out there. Castbox, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher. There's so many of them out there these days. You just type in the darker side of boxing to whatever platform you're on, subscribe for free, get all the latest episodes of the darker side of boxing. It's been an absolute pleasure, as always, Johnston, to cover another dark tale, going into the rabbit hole, the deepest we've probably ever been. Fight fans, thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.